there's a pinnacle question. Every story that you have, every not-so-smart story especially, thinking back to your childhood or your young adult, and you have these stories that you like to bring out at a party or something, there's a question at the pinnacle of each of those stories. And it usually is either now what or what now. And it kind of depends on which way you are in the story. If you want to come out as the hero, you phrase it some way. If you want to come out not so smart, you phrase it the other way. But what will happen is you're in the middle of an event. You're in the middle of some hijinks, some unfortunate circumstances, and you will say, well, now what? Either now what because I have this problem, I don't know what to do with it, or what now because you're totally lost and this has not worked out how you thought it would. Basically, you tell a story, you get to the end, you get to the pinnacle of it, and you say, what now? Somebody didn't think through this all the way. I can give you an example. In fact, I'd give you several thousand, but we'll just stick with one. There was a time I got home from school, I was in high school, and there was a deer and just a smaller doe was in my front yard, and I got out of the car, and it kind of bolted, and I saw that it ran into my backyard, and we had a really tall privacy fence. So I went back there, and after a short kerfuffle, I had myself a deer. And so I was sitting there, I'm on top of this deer now, and it's making all sorts of noises that you didn't know deer would make. And then I asked myself this question. Now what? What do you do with a deer? You don't call game and fish. That's what you don't do. But you've had this moment a number of times. The first time you put your car in the ditch. Well, now what? The first time you spent more than you should have, and you have some bills to pay, and there's some dissonance in your bookkeeping, and you go, well, what now? The first time you agree to go on a date with somebody you shouldn't have agreed to go on a date with, and you're like, all right, what now? What am I doing here? Maybe when you first became a Christian. All right, yeah, I believe it. Like, what now? Or as a Christian, you start to struggle with some things that you didn't think you would have struggled with. What now? Or you get the call, you get the doctor's visit that you didn't ever expect that you would have, that news that you don't want in your life. What do you do now? You're a Christian. This reality is where you are. You believe these things. You love Jesus, but how do I do that now? What now? How do I love Jesus with all this garbage in my life? How do I love Jesus with this thing going on? How do I continue to be a Christian with this going on? This morning, I want you to open up with me to Romans 8. You're going to have to help me, bud. Romans 8. In Romans 8, we're going to be looking at this statement in our final sort of week here in I Believe in the Holy Spirit. And we've been launching off of this verse in 1 Corinthians that now to each one, this is talking about Christians, to each one the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. And we talked about how the Holy Spirit, when He shows up in our lives, does some things, right? We talked about Him as a person. He is showing up. He's the one who's given to us. And then we talked about what He does, that He brings us to life, that He works in us. He is the one who seals us, meaning He's the one who brings us to God. And now, as a Christian, now what? This week, as we look at walking in the Spirit, being a Christian in all the now what now moments of our lives, the Spirit of God is going to work with us, and yet we need to walk with Him in those things. We're going to do that by working through Romans 8. Now, this message is pretty simple, that we need to walk with God. That's his answer. Paul's answer to the what now. He's going to give us, he has a whole beautiful book written, and it comes all the way up to chapter 8, and all of that is leading to, hey, you weren't saved, you were a sinner, you needed Jesus, this is what Jesus did, this is how He helps us, this is how He saves us, He gives us His Spirit, and then beginning in chapter 8, well, it's kind of back through 5, it ramps up, but especially in chapter 8, this is the life you live now. This is the what now what Christian life. It's in the Spirit, and his message is going to be, what do I do there? What do I do with these tensions? What do I do with this struggle? What do I do with this pain? What do I do with these things I don't want that kind of maybe I didn't realize were actually going to happen? That if I would have written the story, I wouldn't have put this in there. And he says, walk with God. That's where he's going to come. Now, we're going to work through this. I want you to look at verses 1 through 4 with me. I'm going to have it on the screen, but it might be easier just as we read for you to follow along in your own Bible. He says, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the life-giving Spirit in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. For God achieved what the law could not do because it was weakened through the flesh by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. And concerning sin, he condemned sin in the flesh so that the righteous requirement of the law may be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. His point here is kind of summarizing almost everything that he said up to this point. He's saying, look, you don't deserve to be saved, but it's because of what God did, and he's applied it to you. It's what Jesus did, and he's applied it to you. So now you get to have the benefits of that. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's the grace. That something happened that we could never have done and applied it to us, which we couldn't have done either. And he says, because of what Jesus did in his own flesh, he completed what we needed, and now that's applied to us, but it's applied to those who are his. That's what it means to be a Christian. And then what do we do with that? What now? How do we live? What now? Now what? How do I do that? And that's where he's going to go with the rest of this. He says, we walk with God. We walk with God. When this is real in your life, when you're actually a Christian, there's a long journey ahead of you. We talk about being a Christian like it's a singular point, but it's not. You're brought into the family, and then from there you continue to grow. You have a whole life ahead of you now. And as Christians, as we walk in this, he says you fight off the flesh. Chapter 6 and 7, he paints this whole picture of what this flesh is. And he's not just talking about flesh like physical body. He's talking about your sin, your old you, the one that loved the things of the world, the one that did not love God, the part of you that you fight against most often, the part of you that you wish didn't exist there, the part of you that convinces you to get into those now what now moments. The flesh is opposed to the Spirit. And that's what he's going to say here. He says, you're a Christian now, and you need to walk this way. Don't fall back into this. Chapter 6 and 7, you don't have to do this. You used to have to. You used to be enslaved to that, but now you're not. Jesus fulfilled these things. He's bought you out of that now. And so what he says is, walk with God. Live like this now because this is who you are. And he's going to make a couple points. So this next section here, starting in verse 5, he's going to contrast the flesh and the Spirit. All right? Follow me with this. He says, for those who live according to the flesh have their outlook shaped by the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit have their outlook shaped by the things of the Spirit. For the outlook of the flesh is death, but the outlook of the Spirit is life and peace. Because the outlook of the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to the law of God, nor is it able to do so. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. He's doubling down on this point. If you're not a Christian, it's not going to make sense. Those who are in the Spirit, this makes sense. Not that you're perfect at it, not that you are all the time it's going to be everything that you think it is. No, but you know it's right. And you know you ought, right? There's something within you that's pulling you that direction. This is kind of why in church ministry, I see a lot of people show up and they'll try it, right? It's like they're trying kind of like a new diet. They show up, well, I'll do the thing, I'll come to a few things, maybe I'll read a little bit of this, I'll try a little of that. And then I just really didn't get the results I wanted. I really just didn't see it affect me. See, if you're not in the Spirit, the things of God, while they're good, and they may actually bring good things to your life, it won't really make sense. Because even in the flesh, if you're trying to do the right things, you can't please God. That's why we needed Jesus. Look, nobody got to where they are because of how great they are. That's the whole point. The only reason we got here is because Jesus brought us here. It's his righteousness that brings us here. Why do you think it's going to be your righteousness that keeps it going? It won't. You need the Spirit of God to work through you, to work in you, to work on you. When you get to those moments, you realize, man, I'm living this. I'm different than I was. Verse 9, he says, you, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. So he's talking to these Christians, right? He says, that's not you. If indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, this person does not belong to him. He's just restating it, kind of making sure it's really clear. Christians love God. Christians live for God. Christians walk with God. And if you're not, if you don't, you're not a Christian. It's just pretty simple. But Paul is smarter than us. Paul is smarter than us, and he knows what you're thinking, which is like, okay, but I have all these what moments in my life. Do I really love God then? Am I really a Christian? If I still struggle with these things, if I'm still wrestling, if I'm still having these doubts or these, does that mean that I'm not a Christian? Does that mean I'm not in the Spirit? And he addresses that. He's writing to Christians because, look, he knows. He knows that if you're in the Spirit, if you are a child of God, you're on a path. It's not just an instantaneous change, but you're on a path that you're going to fall. You're going to stumble. And the bigger question is not just, when will I stumble, but what are you going to do when you do? See, we all struggle with fear of things that we should have faith about. We all struggle with control and things that we should trust God with. We all struggle with wanting to be God and make those decisions for ourselves or for others when we should be relying on God. We all struggle with these. Paul encourages us, not in a way that I think you'd expect. He doesn't go to like, look, if you're struggling, then that's fine. Like, just keep it up, keep your chin up, work harder. That's not what he says. Look where he goes in verse 10. But if Christ is in you, your body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is your life because of righteousness. Moreover, if the Spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, the one who raised Christ from the dead will also make your mortal bodies alive through his Spirit who lives in you. Now, Paul gets a little wordy here, but what he's saying is, if you are struggling, well, you don't look at your struggle and say like, well, I can just struggle harder. I can do it. The encouragement or the hope is he goes, look, who's behind this anyway? It's God. God who raised Jesus from the dead is still working. Interestingly, you would think that he'd make you look kind of, okay, well, just what are you working on? Well, let's just pray about it a little more. Let's just focus on it a little more. But his actual focus goes back to Jesus. Look what Jesus did. There's hope there about what's going to happen for you. The end of the story is already written. So what you get to do then is you say, all right, I am struggling with this. I'm not going to give up. It's not an encouragement to give up. It's an encouragement to hold on to a hope stronger than just like white knuckles. The hope is that I know Jesus came back to life. And that new life is what is going to be applied to me. That's the resurrection power that's going to be living in me. He's going to do that for me. So these struggles, these urges, these thoughts, these feelings, these things that I'm not happy are in my life. Things that I don't want, that I hate. When I look at those, I don't have to look at them as, well, this is my life, and this is what I'm doing, and this is what I have to deal with right now. They're present. Don't ignore them. But the bigger picture is, what are those in the scope of eternity? This is a reminder that God isn't done with you. This is a reminder that he's still doing something. This is the context where you're going to see the resurrection power of Jesus applied in your own life. The struggle is a stage. It's a stage to experience the hope of God in our own life. Walk with God. That's the point. He's saying, look, you have that struggle. Walk with God through it. Immediately, we kind of like have a struggle and we're like, oh, God's mad at me. Well, if I was better, this wouldn't happen. Wouldn't it make sense that if you're following God, he's going to lead you directly to the things that need the most fixing? Right? Doesn't it make sense that if you're walking with him and you're being faithful to him and you're saying, God, I love you and I want to know more about you and I want to grow more, he would say, great, in order to do that, we have to fix some things. There's an area over here that needs a lot of attention. And for most of us, it's things that we don't want to work on. Things like patience. Things like joy. Well, how do you grow joy? Well, it isn't in the easy stuff. In verse 12, he says, so then, brothers and sisters, we are under obligation, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. You have an obligation to walk with God. An obligation. Now, immediately we would think of negative things. Well, I'm obligated to do that. But it's sort of like the doctor saying, hey, if you want to live, if you want to see your kids grow up, you need to change what you're doing. You have an obligation to your family to get up there and exercise. You have an obligation to walk. You have an obligation to live this out. And it's interesting how he phrases that, where he says, all who are led by the Spirit are sons of God, sons and daughters. We're inclusive here, all right? You're in there. It's an identity. He says, you go walk. Walk with God. Why? Because that's who you are. You are obligated to get up and go to work because there's people who depend on you. You're obligated to get up and walk with God because there's people who are depending on you because you're a part of the family. And that's what we do. In this family, we get up, we do the hard work. We do the work of killing sin. We do the work of treasuring Jesus. And it's not easy, but it's right. That's who we are. We're obligated to that. And it's a great obligation because that's where life is. I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can do that, Pastor Noah. I don't think that. You don't know how hard this is. You don't know what's in front of me. You don't know what I've been through. Look at this next verse. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery, leading again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness to our spirit that we are God's children. And if children, then heirs, namely heirs of God, and also fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him so that we may be also glorified with him. Paul does something incredible here. It's not the hard things that convince us that God doesn't love us. That's not how that works. And a lot of people fall into that. I'm going through this hard thing. God must hate me. I'm doing this, this is just, God must be mad. He goes the opposite direction here. He says, I'm putting you in a place so that you can learn how to grow closer to God. I'm putting you in this place so that the Spirit of God will work in you and you will call out to God. That you just listen to people's stories. This is always he brings you to the bottom so that you'll realize just how much he loves you. He brings you through the storm so that you realize he's trustworthy. He takes these things away and that thing away and this thing you thought you needed and that thing that you just swore you had to have and this thing, and he does it to prove that you need him. We go into those, I can't do this. That's not the Spirit of God. That's not the Spirit of God telling you, because the Spirit of God comes along and says, you're adopted. You're loved. You belong here. This is on purpose. I have this for you. As you walk with him in the suffering, he changes you. You see that? He's teaching you to cry out to him. Be aware. Walking with God will bring more suffering into your life. But it's worth it. It's what you need. And he knows that. He knows that you need to kill sin. And you need to treasure Christ more. Like Jesus needs to be more beautiful to you at the end of this year than he was at the beginning. And if you feel like you've become stagnant, like that's not a growing trend in your life, you need to change something. Because I bet there's something else in there that is getting more and more treasured to your heart. Things like comfort and your preference and how you think it ought to be. God's going to bring more and more situations, stages into your life where the hope of God can be lived out. Here's what he says about this. You're like, man, that kind of sounds like bad news. Here's what he says, verse 18. For I consider that our present sufferings cannot even be compared to the glory that will be revealed to us. Now, this is on purpose. This is on purpose. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Walk with God. It will be worth it. And he gives us this example. He goes to creation. For creation eagerly waits for the revelation of the sons of God. Creation itself is waiting because it's under the curse, right? Things are broken in the world. For creation was subjected to futility, meaning creation has this curse on it, not willingly, but because of God who subjected it, in hope that creation itself will also be set free from the bondage of decay into the glorious freedom of God's children. He's saying that there's a point here where you look forward, and even creation has a plan. There's a plan that God has for the world. It's not all going to be broken like this. And what's happening? The earth is groaning. It's breaking. For we know that the whole earth, or the whole creation, groans and suffers together until now. This is the world we live in. And he uses that as an example. Look, if you look in creation, it shouldn't be that way. And God has a plan for it. And it's like creation itself is just waiting. Can you guys get this done? Let's go. There's something better. You can't even compare how bad this is. No. It's worth it. It's worth it. Not only this, but we ourselves also. So creation is experiencing that. What about us? We, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we eagerly await our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. This is the experience of the Christian life where you experience this fruit of the Spirit. And at the same time, there's this painful, hard, unfortunate groaning. Why? But I have this joy. But I also experience this tragedy. And I have this peace from God. I know he's going to care for me, but at the same time, I'm watching people ruin their lives. And there's this kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, there's self-control. All these things are growing in me, and I'm experiencing these things, just the little bits, the first fruits, just the start of harvest. And what do I have? I have that on this, and then on this side, I'm waiting. how do I keep going through all of this? How do I live with this at the same time as this? And he says that's what the Christian life is, that you press on it. But what's interesting is when you do it right, you grow in hope. Your hope actually grows. It's opposite of what you would think. You would think that walking through these really hard things would drain you of hope. But he says, no. No. When you experience what God is doing in your heart, when you walk with the Spirit and he's growing you, and you experience that at the same time as these hardships, instead of it draining and you becoming defeated, you realize, no, God has a bigger plan and he's actually working. Look, this is what he says. For in hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, because who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with endurance. As you walk through, he's saying, obviously it's not done. But he says we have this hope. This hope, this thing that we don't see yet, but we know is coming. And he says, so you eagerly wait for it. You pursue God. You walk with him. And all those things stack up to actually be a process that changes you. He's changing how you view things. He's changing how you do things. He's changing who you are. Walking with God, and it's worth it. It's worth it. When we walk with God, the changes that we experience, those little fruits, they stop being so weird and they become more normal. This is the normal experience. This is the normal experience of life, that I get to have joy where it doesn't make sense. And I have peace about me when that shouldn't be what I have right now. There's hope in the hardship. Look at verse 26. He says, in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what we should pray, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with inexpressible groanings. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes on behalf of the saints according to God's will. Now it gets a little confusing there. What does he mean? He's saying that we're experiencing this groaning, right? So we have the fruit of the Spirit happening and growing in us, and then we have this groaning. How do we do this? What is life going to be like? What now? Now what? And he says, you're not alone in that. Actually, the Spirit of God within you is able to understand that, to walk with you through that, to groan with you in that. You're right, this isn't how it's supposed to be. And it says, then when God, he says, he who searches our hearts, that's God, right? That's the Father looking down. And when he looks down in us, he doesn't see us in our guilt and our shame. He sees the Spirit of God expressing perfectly our groaning. This is what it is. This is what it's like to live with our hope, but our hurt at the same time. And he uses that to change us. He's actually walking with us through this, and this is where he takes that. Here you are as a Christian. You experience some of this growth, you experience all this groaning, and you're like, I don't really know why God would make me do it this way. Like it feels like there should be an easier way to do this. But this is what he says. And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Because those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that his Son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. What he means by that is the suffering that we go through, the painful process where he brings us closer to him and it causes us to kill off sin, where he stretches our hearts so we can love him more, that painful, good thing was planned. In fact, it's because he knew what you needed that he planned it this way. And this is important because a lot of us feel like the victim of circumstance. In my life, this happened to me and I just have to deal with it. And it's like, man, what What if God was doing something bigger than that? What if he actually was working at the very corner of your heart that could only change if he brought you through this? It's for your good. Why? Because you're a saint. Because you're in the Spirit. Because he's changing you to look like Jesus. That's what this verse says. So why do we not do it? I think I'm pretty smart. I think I argued my point to you. You all agree with me, right? About the smart thing? I mean, you agree with me, right? This makes sense. He's working in us. He's bringing us through hard things. It's so that we would change to be like Jesus. So why don't we just do it with a good attitude? I think it's because the what now what moments are scary. They scare us enough to think that God doesn't really love us. They scare us enough that if God loved me, he wouldn't be doing this. Maybe I wouldn't say he hates me, but he's at least annoyed with me. God, at least, he kind of resents me. He's disappointed in me. But see, that's not how God sees his children. He brings us through all of these things, and this is how he sees us. Those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. Notice that these are in the past tense. When God looks at us, he sees us complete. He doesn't see us as this disappointment, this resentment, this guilt, he doesn't see that. He sees us as 100% accepted, 100% belonging. And he's just calling us along. He just wants to walk with us. It's this father enjoying his children, celebrating his children, walking with his children. And that's what the Spirit does in us. I remember reading about Queen Elizabeth. She would remind her son, Prince Charles, when he was young, before they had this large event, right? They were about to go out and onto the stage. And she would say, "Remember, Charles, you're royalty. Remember, you're royalty. Remember, this is who you are. So you need to go live according to that. The way that you're going to walk across this stage, the way you're going to suffer in front of people, the way you're going to grow, you do it as royalty. Remember, you are children of the King. You're God's children. Remember who you are. You're royalty." And he says, walk this way. Walk this way. Because then you're going to be able to find the hope that's embedded in every scary situation. And you're going to be able to find the hope that's in every heartbreaking tragedy. And in every challenging joy. And in every what now what moment. God is working. God is inviting you to walk with him. And the Spirit of God is going to empower you to do that.